Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis Undiano. Our guest today is a veteran environmentalist leader, activist, and author. Carl Pope was executive director of the legendary Sierra Club from 1992 through 2010, and he is the personification of environmental protection to millions of people. We are pleased to have him here today on our show. Carl, I want to welcome you to
Great to be with you here.
Conversations. You really are a kind of icon, if you don't mind my saying that, in the environmental movement.
Well, I do, but you've said it.
To lots and lots of people. There must have been something very powerful early in your life that got you oriented in this direction. You spent 30 years at the Sierra Club, your entire adult life working on environmental issues. What was it that got you so committed to going in this direction?
Well, the reality is I didn't start out to be an environmentalist. I started out in international development. And then, kind of, it was 1970, I was looking for a job, honestly, for a year before I went to graduate school. And I started working on the environment, and I never went to graduate school. And I kept working. So what kept me there was the experience of working on it and the experience of finding out how deeply and passionately Americans cared about their heritage and how many opportunities and challenges there were in leaving it behind them. So it was actually the work itself that motivated me to want to do and to keep doing the work.
Well, you were at the Sierra Club for altogether about 30 years, right? Executive director for about 18.
More than that.
What was the Sierra Club? Okay, it started, legendary Sierra Club, everybody knows about it. Started in 1892. What was it like? What was the Sierra Club you found when you came on board?
Well, it was changing very rapidly. It was just after the first Earth Day, 1973. The organization had just decided that if you really wanted to protect wild places, you had to worry about air and water pollution and energy. And we were beginning to work on those things, and that was a whole new set of learnings. But I mean, the funny thing I remember was, it's hard to think back, but you kept lists in 1973 on these sticky sheets called Avery labels. And if you wanted to send somebody a letter, you had to put a piece of carbon paper behind your letter if you wanted to have a copy.
I remember carbon paper. Oh, yeah.
And when I look back at the limited communication tools we had, and yet we still managed to get a lot of good work done, you sort of wonder sometimes if all this modern connectivity is quite as productive as we think it is. We do a lot more stuff, but do we get a lot more done? Not quite as clear.
Now, if somebody looks into the history of environmentalism in the U.S., they're going to look at 19th century preservationism, sort of wanting just to stand in awe of the cathedral of nature, John Muir's idea of the fountain of life, etc. By the time you come on board with the Sierra Club, conservation is a kind of scientific stewardship of the environment. Would that be a way to talk about it?
Well, that was one strand, but the Muir strand kept on going. The Sierra Club was always more in Muir's camp and not so much into the management camp.
Okay, because the Sierra Club actually started out organizing tours and hikes and that kind of thing. Did you, the focus on public policy, was that, that's a big part of the Sierra Club. Was that already a strong strand? Did you bring that in,
No,
make it
I
stronger?
did. That was a strong strand. Actually, the history was Muir was all about public policy.
Okay.
He used to say, any fool can cut a tree. It takes Uncle Sam to save one. And then there was a period in the 20s and the 30s when the emphasis on public policy went down quite a bit, and that was the era of the high trips and the hiking.
Right.
And then after World War II, David Brower's generation came back, and they had fought in the mountains of Italy with the 10th Mountain Division, and they came back and said, we don't want America's mountains trashed like Italy's, and they got back into public policy. Brower really created the public policy emphasis. And I simply came in. When I came in, he had just left, and that was going strong.
John McPhee's Encounters with the Archdruid about David Brower left a huge impression on me. I mean, what a great
that was a book that made a big impression on me,
now, you increased the membership a lot, too, like some 400,000 while you were there?
Well, the club, you have to remember that again, think about the technology.
Yeah.
Before 1980, there wasn't direct mail. And if you joined an organization, you probably joined the organization because somebody asked you to, somebody you knew.
Yeah.
So the club had gotten to be about 150,000 when I became executive director, 180,000. And then direct mail came in, and we began to grow very rapidly. And then after direct mail, there was the internet, there was online communications, there was social networking. It became possible to reach much, much larger numbers of people. But the trade-off was they didn't know you as well.
Right.
So not all those 400,000 members were doing much. And the big challenge I had during my years as executive director was how to tap that potential, how to find those people who cared enough to send us $35, but they didn't know anybody. And so they didn't really know what to do. How did we engage them? And that's still a struggle.
Now it got up to, isn't the membership around 1,200,000?
We now have members and supporters because a lot of the younger generation thinks about these activities differently. Their view is, I'm with you when I'm doing something with you, and then maybe next year I'm doing something with somebody else.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to join. I don't want to pay dues. I'll give you money, but I don't want to pay dues. So the shift has gone from membership as a voting thing to membership and support as a participatory thing.
Now, to an outsider looking in at the Sierra Club, and I'm trying to look at it through the lens of your work there, the effort of the Sierra Club doesn't seem to be one traditionally that's hand in hand with the corporate world or unions or anything like that. But I noticed around the mid-2000s, change in what you're doing, the Blue-Green Alliance with the United Steelworkers, and then 2008, you got involved in the Boone T. Pickens $12 billion wind turbine project. I mean, this was very exciting at the time. I remember when you all met at his place in Texas. That's a very different direction. It looks like you're starting to move off in your own direction with efforts like that. Or am I wrong? Was that something the Sierra Club felt comfortable with?
No, the Sierra Club was comfortable with the fact that we had to go broader, because what happened was in 2005, we went out, we had our first big national convention. We had 3,000 leaders from all around the country into San Francisco. We said, what should we do for the next decade? And really, quite to my surprise, our grassroots leadership said, do climate. We had worked on climate, but it had never been our central focus. In 2005, our membership and then our board said, make climate your big priority. And when we looked at the climate challenge, one of the things that stood out at us was, if we stopped every single project that was going to be proposed anywhere in the world from 2005 on, we would not solve the climate crisis. You could not solve the climate crisis just by stopping things. You still had to stop bad things, but you also had to make wind turbines and efficiency and mass transit and solar power. You had to take all those things to scale. So we found ourselves in the economic development business for a very particular kind of sustainable economy. We moved from, if the first generation was preservation, the second generation was pollution and stewardship, the third effort had to be sustainability. And sustainability meant a different kind of relationship with the economy, because we now just, it's not enough to slow things down. We have to stop some things, like coal-fired power plants. We have to slow down other things, like our dependence on natural gas. And we have to speed up still other things, like high-performance engines and solar power.
See, I might be overly influenced by somebody you and I were talking about earlier, Nordhaus and Schellenberger, you know, that famous essay in 2004, The Death of Environmentalism. And one of the points they made, and I really connect this with you actually more than them, was the whole initiative to be for things rather than trying to stop things. And from an outsider's perspective, it seems like the Sierra Club was forever trying to stop bad things from happening. And then here you are in the middle 2000s, partnering with people that haven't traditionally been part of the environmental world, and you're trying to make some exciting things happening. Isn't that a pretty big switch from retarding and stopping to being proactive?
Yeah, that is a big switch, but the history is a little bit different. If you go back to the first era, what was John Muir doing? He was creating national parks. He wasn't stopping things.
Right.
He was creating national parks, in many cases, in places where nobody thought of doing anything. But when you got into the pollution era, cleaning up pollution was about, you know, cleaning up bad things.
Right.
So the pollution era from, say, 1970 to 2005, that 35 years was pretty much about stopping bad stuff.
Yeah.
And then when you turned to the climate and sustainability challenge, when you went global,
right,
you said, well, look, excuse me, but they need new power plants in India. They need new electricity. So we're going to have to find something that will do the job without polluting the planet. So you did make a big shift, but it was a shift that was really produced by the change in the focus of the issues and a change in the scale.
It seems to me that you were part of a redefinition of a couple of very important concepts. The notion of the commons on the one hand, it seemed like you broadened that out, and now the commons wasn't just nature in that traditional sense. It was industrial muscle. You know, it was possible to have environmental initiatives that dealt with you know, a much broader notion of what we can draw on. Weren't you redefining the commons?
Well, I think that I mean, that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it that way, and I'm not sure I'd say we were redefining the commons, although the commons had dropped out of public discourse. So I thought we were really reviving the notion of the commons, because the notion of the commons always included the town square as well as the village park.
Right.
Those were both common spaces. And I think in the 80s, I mean, one of the things Ronald Reagan, unfortunately, really did was he had no use for the commons.
Right.
He thought it was just not relevant. And so that sort of dropped out of public concern. And I think actually right now, as you and I speak, and we look at this whole battle about the function of the federal government, the function of government, according to the Constitution, is to provide for the common welfare, the general welfare. It's not the private welfare, it's the general common welfare. So the concept of the commons was a very important part of American constitutional history, which from 1980 started getting discarded.
Right.
And we brought it back, but I don't think we really redefined it.
The other thing that I think of from that period, and sometimes in your writing is really dramatic, is a whole new perspective on the notion of cost. For example, there was a Sierra Club study in 2009 of Appalachia mining, famous study, where you all ended up concluding that the real human health, social cost of mining as an activity in that region was 5 times greater than the benefit of mining as a narrowly conceived as a business. I mean, isn't that a different definition, important definition of cost?
Well, it's really an honest accounting.
Yeah, right.
I mean, actually, one of the fundamental things that we discovered as we began to look at climate and energy issues was society was operating from a set of cooked books.
Yeah.
People didn't know what things cost, and people weren't being told the truth about what things cost. That study, incidentally, is famous because we made it famous, but it was actually done by the University of West Virginia. It wasn't done by us.
Oh, I thought
it was a University of West Virginia study where they looked and said, okay, here's, in purely economic terms, here's what coal costs Appalachia, here's what coal gives Appalachia. Appalachia was a net loser on coal. And that turns out to be true across the board. I'll tell you a surprising thing. You know, everybody says, oh, well, the reason we use fossil fuels is because they're cheap. They're not cheap anymore. Maybe they were cheap once upon a time. But even in out-of-pocket costs, at $100 a barrel, at $4.25 a gallon, oil and gasoline are not cheap. There are a lot of cheaper ways to get to work than filling up your car with $4.25 gasoline. But you don't have the option of using them. You don't have choices. So what we need to do is to say, wait a minute, when we gave the oil industry, and I know I'm in Oklahoma, but when we gave the oil industry a monopoly on our transportation sector, we did a foolish thing. Because one of the things we know about monopolies is at the end of the day, they gouge you. That's what they do. We gave oil a monopoly on transportation, and we need to break that monopoly.
See, I think you're an insider, and maybe I see the drama more of this recalculation of costs. I think it's really big. When people talk about electric cars, it's so simple. You just plug it in your garage, and it's so clean. And what about all the coal that was used to generate the electricity to begin with? That's the real cost, right? That's the kind of analysis that you got the rest of us to think about.
Well, you do need to, but it actually turns out, in fact, that we're going to be replacing that coal with something cleaner, so go buy an electric car. I mean, yes, right now, in some parts of the country, the electricity is not as clean as you would like, but it's going to get cleaner. But gasoline is not going to get cleaner, so you're still better off driving an electric car. And we need to make them cheaper, and we need to bring them to scale, and we need to give you more places to charge them. One of the reasons you won't drive an electric car is because you're not sure you're driving to Salt Lake City where you're going to power up. You're not sure.
I think you and others in the environmental movement have really taught the rest of us that more pieces need to be on that table. The real costs, social costs, what's subsidized, what's hidden, if there's carbon emissions, and they're being stacked up in a poor neighborhood, and the wealthy neighborhood doesn't have to deal with that. Somebody's still paying that price.
Cooking the books has always been a bad
Cooking the
idea.
books. I
and
like
that's
that.
what we have done over and over again in the environmental arena, is we have let people count their profits and not take into account the losses that were being imposed on the rest of us.
So by the end of that decade, say by 2009, 2010, this is really the perspective on the environment, really. It has to do with manufacturing and the real cost that it takes to do things, not the hidden costs. Don't you think that's a change that takes place over that 10 years?
Over that 10 years, let me think. It probably took place over 15 years, actually,
Okay.
because we began dealing with trade issues at the end of the first Bush administration. And we began dealing with them because the Sierra Club was trying to protect tropical rainforests, and we were trying to protect them in Myanmar. And so we were getting states to say they wouldn't allow wood that had been sourced from Myanmar to be sold inside their state.
Right.
And we started hearing that we were about to sign a trade agreement that would make it illegal for states to do that. So we began to realize that people's democratic rights to say, wait a minute, we have values and we want to reflect those values in what we buy, those rights were being threatened by a whole new global pattern of commerce. And we had to deal with that whole pattern of commerce. And as we dug into it, we discovered things like, look, if I went into your backyard and you have a prize rose, it's 100 years old, I dig it up and I go into a truck down the street and I sell it. I'm not engaging in commerce, I'm fencing, I'm committing a crime. 90% of the mahogany that comes into the United States from Peru is stolen illegally in Peru. It's fencing. This is not trade, this is fencing.
Yeah.
But it got called trade. So all of a sudden environmentalists were dealing with trade rules, not something we had a lot of expertise about, frankly. But if you followed the global economy, you got pulled into a lot of things that were new. Another example on the good side, broadband access. I mean, you would say, what does that have to do with the environment? Well, it turns out that in communities where people have good broadband access, they don't have to drive as much. They save a lot of fossil fuels, maybe 10, 15% of our fossil fuels would be saved if all Americans had access to broadband that's as good as it is in South Korea. So all of a sudden you say, well, there's a solution. Who'd have thunk it?
This notion, I guess maybe it would come under environmental justice. I'm not sure how to describe it. Does seem to be a new paradigm to me. It's not preservationism, it's not conservationism, and it brings a lot of people together. There's a class dimension of it, but potentially environmentalists are going to be working with manufacturers.
Well, environmentalists are working with manufacturers. I mean, if you look and say, okay, we at the Sierra Club supported the rescue of the U.S. auto companies, but we supported the rescue of the U.S. auto companies under the conditions that they remake themselves for sustainability, which Ford and GM did. So there was a case where we partnered on rescuing Ford and GM in exchange for an understanding that Ford and GM would start investing in the cars of the future, which were going to be efficient and electric.
Does this have to do also with the doubling of mileage per gallon?
Yes, and we knew that was happening as part of the package as well.
Yeah.
But again, you would not have seen an environmental organization back in 1965, or even the first Chrysler bailout, which I think was 1974. Environmentalists weren't in that game.
Yeah, yeah. Talk to me a little bit about the opposition to environmental issues. And it seems like a large subject to me. I mean, there's specific examples like the wise use movement, which I know is it's a coalition of a lot of very, very far-right, anti-environmental issues people. But there seems to be some resistance to the insights of science, to the processes of science. How do you read the opposition to recognizing environmental issues?
Well, I think it is a complicated landscape, and it's important not to lump everybody together.
Right.
The fundamental opposition is a way of thinking and a set of business practices that go along with a way of thinking, which says the most important thing we can do is to take natural resources and turn them into money quickly.
Yeah.
And nothing else matters. That's what Wallace Stegner, the great writer, called the boomer mentality in the West. It wasn't the settler who came out to build a community. It was the guy who came in to cut down the trees and move on, or to dig the mine and play it out and move on. It was the moving on mentality. That moving on mentality is still with us, and it leads to business practices like clear-cutting forests, mountaintop removal as a way of mining coal, irresponsible development of natural gas and oil, chemical factories that you don't maintain, you just run them into the ground and you pollute the surrounding community. That's the big enemy. It always has been. And it's an enemy that really is rooted in three values: lack of respect for the natural world, a lack of concern for the future, and a really hardwired selfish individualism. What's in it for me now? Now that's the real, enduring, ongoing opposition to environmental preservation. But at any given time, there are also going to be people who, for very different and much more valid reasons, don't see eye to eye with the Sierra Club. Because, you know, the reality is all of the coal in coal seams in West Virginia is going to be mined. It's running out. But if I'm a coal miner in West Virginia and I'm being told that the Sierra Club wants to move beyond coal, I feel very directly threatened. And that is a reasonable response to say, hell no, I want to keep my job. So there are people who, for reasons other than being boomers or the cowboy economics, don't agree with environmentalists. And finally, there is a set of people who candidly do this for political reasons. They may not really care at all. I mean, if you watch politicians change side, you know that they didn't all change sides because they changed their hearts. They changed sides because they decided, I can get more campaign contributions over here. So there's also a group of people who, in some sense, are simply being bought and sold, or rented, in some cases only rented.
You know, I think there's some barriers to understanding environmentalism that are in some ways understandable. The Rasmussen Energy Report says that, you know, at any given moment, you know, roughly about half the country think there's nothing to worry about with the environment. And maybe they could say, well, the science behind understanding global warming is complicated, where effects are displaced by decades from their causes. You either have to be sophisticated in science or just have a lot of patience to understand that. But I think what you're saying is there are maybe some unscrupulous folks who are exploiting the natural difficulty of understanding environmental issues because they can and because they've got ulterior motives. Would that be?
Well, absolutely. And I would say that, in fact, lots of things about environmental science are complicated, and lots of things about environmental science are uncertain.
Yeah.
But if you look at the history, it turns out that conservative politicians did not decide that global warming was a hoax because conservative voters did. They decided because their campaign contributors decided, and then the voters followed the politicians.
And it was a convenience, and then once they're out there on that limb, they stay with it.
It's a well-paid convenience, frankly. I mean, they got lots of campaign contributions from, and the Koch brothers really do have a very, very major, if you will, almost controlling interest in the Tea Party. That doesn't mean that most people in the Tea Party care about what happens to Koch Industries. They're just out there protecting their communities. But the messages they're getting on Fox are messages which are paid for by companies with financial interests and ideological beliefs.
Now, there are some organizations, and I think you're connected with some of these, that are trying to advance the good, to try to encourage a new kind of thinking about manufacturing and the environment and bring a lot of people together. The Apollo Alliance, I think you were one of the founders of that. Any of those that you think is particularly effective, or maybe you'd like to say a few words about?
Well, I mean, the Apollo Alliance has now merged with another organization I helped start, which was the Blue-Green Alliance. And the Blue-Green Alliance now has 13 million members. That's a huge number, much larger than the membership in the environmental movement. And what it's effective at is identifying where a vibrant American economy and a healthy American environment are partners. And that's the common thing. The reality is we need to build a lot of new factories in this country. And any new factories we build are going to be cleaner than the factories they replace. We need to replace and upgrade America's housing stock. And the houses we build are going to be better environmentally than the houses they replace. We need a new grid, and that grid is going to be more sustainable than the grid we've got today. The challenge we face in the United States right now is very simple. We need to move into the future faster than our competitors. And the people who don't want to move into the future are actually the people who are invested in the dirty technologies of the past because they want to keep using old factories, old houses, old power plants. So we're in a moment when moving America forward fast.
Will be job creating for one thing.
It's job creating. It's good for workers.
Yeah.
It's good for environmentalists. It's good for the economy. It's good for health. So there's a huge win-win, but there are people invested in the past, and they're going to fight.
If 2 or 3 things we could make happen right now, we'll decide on this show, that ought to happen in regard to the environment, what would they be over the next couple of years?
We would create a national funding mechanism which would enable any city or state or business that wanted to modernize its infrastructure and could prove that it could pay the money back to borrow the money to do so very cheaply and pay it back very reliably. We would rebuild America in the next 20 years as if we had just been through a major war. We have not been through a major war, but we have a lot of old stuff.
Our infrastructure
left over
is in bad shape.
In very bad shape. And we would upgrade, modernize, and replace it all over the next 20 years. And we would build the educational system that's necessary to train people to do that work.
Okay.
That's actually all we need. We need a way to borrow the money cheaply. I would nominate the federal government. It can borrow money for almost nothing. But it shouldn't spend the money. It should get paid back. Because when people build a more energy efficient house and don't have a utility bill, I mean, what's not to like about not having a utility bill? When you don't have a utility bill, you can afford to pay for the insulation you put in. Okay,
personal question to end this up. When they write the history of environmentalism in this time, what do you hope to say about you?
That John Muir had a saying. He said, when you try to pull one thing in the universe, you find out that it's hitched to everything else. And I would like to hope that as I've done this work, I have kept following the hitching posts to find out where they led.
Carl Pope, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure and honor to have you on the show today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for being with us for this edition of Current Conversations. I hope you will join us again next time. Thank you for watching.